The genetic expansion of the Armenoids, Caucasian Iranian DNA, or Irano-Caucasian DNA. But before we get too deep into the video, first I want to tell you guys about my social media platforms. So I have a Clubhouse account, and we can actually talk to one another on it. I also host Clubhouse rooms every now and then where I might talk about history and genetics of the Middle East and Africa. I have a Twitter page, a Facebook account, and a Facebook page, as well as a Instagram, all titled The Hebrew of Israel. And what I typically do on these platforms is post upcoming videos as well as slides for my presentations. And so just be on the lookout for all of that on my social media platforms. And if you want to support me financially for the channel, you can look at my Patreon as well as my PayPal and my GoFundMe. And with all of that out of the way, let's begin with the video. Modern Middle Easterners are genetically Indo-European and Caucasian, and by nature non-Semitic. We determined this by looking at isolated Middle Eastern populations. We also looked at populations that they are related to as well. This is from genetic evidence for an origin of the Armenians from Bronze Age mixing of multiple populations. So it reads, the Armenians are a culturally isolated population who historically inhabited a region in the Near East bound by the Mediterranean and Black Seas and the Caucasus, but remained underrepresented in genetic studies and have a complex history, including a major geographic displacement during World War I. We find that Armenians form a distinctive cluster linking the Near East, Europe, and the Caucasus. We show that Armenian diversity can be explained by several mixtures of Eurasian populations that occurred between 3000 and 2000 BCE, a period characterized by major population migrations after the domestication of the horse, appearance of chariots, and the rise of advanced civilizations in the Near East. However, genetic signals of population mixture cease after 12,000 BCE, when Bronze Age civilizations in the Eastern Mediterranean world suddenly and violently collapsed. Armenians have since remained isolated, and genetic structure within the population developed 500 years ago when Armenia was divided between the Ottomans and the Safavid Empire in Iran. Finally, we show that Armenians have higher genetic affinity to Neolithic Europeans than other present-day Near Easterners. I'm going to read that again. Finally, we show that Armenians have higher genetic affinity to Neolithic Europeans than other present-day Near Easterners, and that 29% of Armenian ancestry may originate from an ancestral population that is best represented by Neolithic Europeans. And this makes sense, considering that Armenians are Indo-European speakers by technicality, so to speak, a mixed Indo-European and Caucasian language. So continuing, it says, in the present study, we investigate the Armenians, a population today confined to the Caucasus, but who occupied eastern Turkey. They have also their own alphabet and language, which is classified as an independent branch of the Indo-European language family. The Armenian language is a subject of interest and debate among linguists for its distinctive phonological developments within Indo-European languages and for its affinity to Balkan languages such as Greek and Albanian. The historical homeland of the Armenians sits north of the Fertile Crescent, a region of substantial importance to modern human evolution. Furthermore, Armenia's location may have been important for the spread of Indo-European languages, since it is believed to encompass or be close to the Proto-Indo-European homeland, Anatolia or Pontic Steppe, from which the Indo-Europeans and their culture spread to Western Europe, Central Asia, and India. Armenians were found to have genetic affinity to several other populations, including the Jews, Druze, and Lebanese Christians, in addition to show genetic continuity with the Caucasus. So those are the type of populations that Armenians are found to have genetic affinities with. And remember, Armenians are Indo-Europeans. So they have genetic affinity to these populations. So, continuing, it says Armenians' relationship to world populations. And it reads, we observe that Armenians form a distinctive cluster bound by Europeans, Near Easterners, and the Caucasus populations. More specifically, Armenians are close to Spaniards, Italians, and Romanians from Europe, Lebanese, Jews, Druze, and Cretans from the Near East, and Georgians and Abkhazans from the Caucasus. So specifically, Armenians are related to mostly, actually all three Indo-European, Near Eastern, and Caucasian populations. And most of the populations basically are non-Semitic speakers. So that's very important to keep in mind, with a few of these populations being Semitic speakers. So in a sense, you kind of start to have to ask yourself, why are some of these groups who are Semitic speakers related to mostly non-Semitic speakers? But anyways, let's keep going. The admixture pattern in Armenians appears similar to patterns we have observed in some other genetic isolates in the region, such as Sephardic Jews and Lebanese Christians, who show limited admixture with cultural different neighboring populations in the last 2 millennia. Our test suggests that Armenians had no significant admixture or no significant mixture with other populations in their recent history, and have thus been genetically isolated since the end of the Bronze Age 3,000 years ago. We find in Armenians and other genetic isolates in the Near East high shared ancestry with ancient European farmers. Let me read that again because that's important. We find in Armenians and other genetic isolates in the Near East high shared ancestry with ancient European farmers, with ancestry proportions being similar to present-day Europeans, but not to present-day Near Easterners. Read that part again. With ancestry proportions being similar to present-day Europeans, but not to present-day Near Easterners. So Armenians and other genetic isolates in the Near East are basically very similar, if not basically the same as Europeans. So let's keep reading. These results suggest that genetic isolates in the Near East, Cretans and island population, Near Eastern Jews and Christians, religious isolates, and Armenians, ethno-linguistic isolate, probably retained the features of an ancient genetic landscape in the Near East that had more affinity to Europe than the present populations do. So let's read that last part again. The features of an ancient genetic landscape, dealing with those populations we just read, in the Near East that had more affinity to Europe than present-day populations do. So in the ancient past, populations of people were basically more genetically like Europeans than it is today. And it says, our tests show that most of the Near East genetic isolates ancestry that is shared with Europeans can be attributed to expansion after the Neolithic period. So what expansion is that? It makes a lot of sense that this could be the Indo-European migrations that began to occur into the Middle East, which explains why Middle Easterners have this European genetic connection. So let's read that last part one more time. Our studies show that most of the Near Eastern genetic isolate ancestry that is shared with Europeans can be attributed to expansions after the Neolithic period. So that could be referring to the Proto-Indo-European migrations into the Near East with the Yamnaya culture, groups like Hittites coming into the Near East, which is in Anatolia, groups like the Mitanni coming into the Near East, which was in Syria, northern Iraq, groups like the Cassites coming into the Near East, which was in Babylon of Iraq. A lot of Europeans were in the ancient Near East, and apparently some of these Europeans that settled in the Middle East still exist today in isolated communities like the Armenians and other isolated groups. So there definitely is a European presence in the ancient Near East, and the descendants of these Indo-Europeans in the Near East still exist today. This is why we cannot say that all Middle Easterners are Semitic. This is also why we cannot say that, let's just use Jesus as an example, that he looked Middle Eastern, because it's a population of various different people groups with backgrounds. So this is very important to de-infiltrate when it comes to these different things. So continuing with the study, it says, here we investigate the information that can be obtained by genetic analysis of present-day Armenians and comparison with other present-day and ancient samples. The position of the Armenians within global genetic diversity appears to mirror the geographical location of Turkey, which forms a bridge connecting Europe, the Near East, and the Caucasus. It is believed to have been the origin and/or route for migrating Near Eastern farmers towards Europe during the Neolithic, and has probably also played a major role in the dispersal of the Indo-European languages. We covered that in the past. Check out my Anatolian origin of Indo-European languages, as well as my Armenian origin of Indo-European languages. So, because it covers how Indo-Europeans would have crossed through Anatolia and to go to Europe, Proto-Indo-Europeans would have crossed through Anatolia to go to Europe, or how they could have came from Armenia, go through Anatolia, and then into Europe. So that's what that's referring to. So continuing, it says, Armenians' adoption of a distinctive culture early in their history resulted in their genetic isolation from their surroundings. Their genetic resemblance today to other genetic isolates in the Near East, but not to most other Near Easterners, suggests that recent admixture has changed the genetic landscape in most populations in the region. Let me read that again. Suggests that recent admixture has changed the genetic landscape in most populations in the region. Armenians' genetic diversity reveals that the ancient Near East had higher affinity to Neolithic Europe than it does now, and that Bronze Age demographic processes has a major impact on the genetics of populations in this region. So again, Armenians' genetic diversity reveals that the ancient Near East had higher affinity to Neolithic Europe than it does now. That's important. So reading what's down below, isolated populations are emerging as a powerful tool for many different genetic investigations, such as rare variant associations with complex phenotypes and the characterization of gene-environment interactions. So this is from the Genomic History of the Middle East, and it reads, present-day Levantines are drawn toward Bronze Age Europeans. Let me read that again. Present day Levantines, people in the Levant, people in modern day Israel, Palestine, or Canaan, are drawn towards Bronze Age Europeans. Iraqi Arabs, Iraqi Kurds, and Assyrians appear relatively closer to ancient Iranians. Again, Middle Eastern populations with European and Iranian, which is again just a branch of Europeans, type of ancestry, type of relatedness. We found an ancestry related to ancient Iranians that is ubiquitous today in all Middle Easterners. Previous studies showed that this ancestry was not present in the Levant during the Neolithic period, but appeared in the Bronze Age when Europeans were beginning to migrate, where 50% of the local ancestry was replaced by a population carrying ancient Iran-related ancestry. This population potentially introduced the Y chromosome haplogroup J1 into the region. And this is why I say J in its origin likely isn't Semitic. It's more European and Caucasian in its origin. When it comes to the people who were the first J1 men speaking a language, they would have been European and Caucasian. This is from Continuity and Admixture in the last 5 millennia of Levantine history from ancient Canaanites and present-day Lebanese genome sequences. And it reads, we sought to estimate the time when the Iranian ancestry penetrated the Levant. The most significant result was for mixture of Levant Neolithic and Iran Chalcolithic around 181 plus minus 54 generations ago, or 5,000 plus minus 1,500 years ago, assuming a generation time of 28 years. The admixture time also overlaps with the rise and fall of the Akkadian Empire, which controlled the region from Iran to the Levant between 4.4 and 4.2 KYA. The Akkadian collapse is argued to have been the result of a widespread edification event around 4,200 years ago, probably caused by a volcanic eruption. Archaeological evidence in this period documents large-scale influxes of refugees from northern Mesopotamia towards the south, where cities and villages became overpopulated. That's likely referring to the Kora or Axis migrations. Future sampling of ancient DNA from northern Syria and Iraq may reveal if these migrants carried the Iranian Chalcolithic related ancestry we observe in Bronze Age Sidon and Jordan. And we find that that is to be the case because this paper came out in 2017, and this paper, which came out in 2021, pretty much confirms that present-day Levantines are drawn towards Bronze Age Europeans. Iraqi Arabs, Iraqi Kurds, and Assyrians appear closer to ancient Iranians. So we did get the answer to that question, in that the population was replaced. 50% of the local population was replaced by Iranian-related ancestry that also carried the J marker. So, in Iranian peoples, just to remind you, the Iranian peoples are a diverse Indo-European ethno-linguistic group identified by their use of the Iranian languages and other cultural similarities. So, first it begins with Proto-Indo-European, and then from Proto-Indo-European, you get specifically what we're focusing on, the Proto-Indo-Iranian. And then down below, Proto-Indo-Iranian was a Sastram language, likely removed less than a millennia from its ancestor, the late Proto-Indo-European language, and in turn removed less than a millennia from the Vedic Sanskrit of the Rig Veda, its descendants. Proto-Indo-Iranian has been considered to form a subgroup along with Greek, Armenian, and Peregrine on the basis of many striking similarities in the morphological structure. Check out previous videos that actually detail the connection, the genetic connection between Greeks, Armenians, and Iranians and Indians. So the Proto-Indo-Iranian Proto-Iranians are believed to have emerged as a separate branch of the Indo-Iranians in Central Asia in the mid-2nd millennium BC. The ancient Iranian peoples who emerged around the 1st millennium BC include, I'm not going to name all these groups, but just the famous ones, the Alans, Medes, Parthians, Persians, Sacs, Scythians, and probably Cimmerians, among other Iranian-speaking peoples in Western Asia, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and the Eastern Steppe or Steppe. Modern Iranian peoples include the Baloch, Kurds, Lurs, Persians, and various other groups. J2-M172 is the most common haplogroup in Iran at 23%, almost exclusively represented by J2A-M410 subclade at 93%. The other major subclade being J2B-M12. Apart from Iranians, J2 is common in Arabs, Mediterranean, and Balkan peoples, Serbs, Greeks, Albanians, Italians, Macedonians, Bulgarians, Turks, etc., etc. In the Caucasus, Armenians, Georgians, Chechens, English, northeastern Turkey, northwestern Iran, Kurds, Persians, whilst its frequencies drop suddenly beyond Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northern India. In Europe, J2A is more common in the southern Greece and southern Italy, whilst J2B, J2-M12, is more common in Thracia, Macedonia, and central northern Italy. Thus, J2A and its subgroups within it have a wide distribution from Italy to India, whilst J2B is mostly confined to the Balkans and Italy. So what's interesting about that whole section we just read is that I did a video series in the past detailing specifically J2, being very strongly present among ancient Europeans and modern Europeans, as you can see, all these groups having it, stretching from, as they said, Italy to India. And so check out previous videos that actually detail that. I start with the Greeks, the Armenians, the Iranians, and then the Indians that all have haplogroup J, specifically J2. And it's very interesting to see. So the Armenians are a genetically isolated population. Armenians are Indo-Europeans. Armenia was likely the homeland of Proto-Indo-Europeans. Armenians form a distinctive cluster linking Europeans, Near Easterners, and Caucasians. Armenians have high genetic affinity to Neolithic Europeans. Armenians have genetic affinity to Jews, Druze, and Lebanese Christians, Spaniards, Italians, Romanians, Cretans, Georgians, and Azerbaijanis, etc. We find in Armenians and other genetic isolates in the Near East high shared ancestry with ancient European farmers, with ancestry proportions being similar to present-day Europeans. Genetic isolates in the Near East retain the features of the ancient genetic landscape of the Near East that had more affinity to Europe. So basically what we see is that there is an ancient presence of Europeans in the Middle East, and that the descendants of these peoples with ancestry to ancient Europeans is still present today. There are Near Eastern populations that are quite literally Indo-Europeans or related to Indo-Europeans. Again, the Middle East is a complex location. Not everyone there is a Semitic person, and you cannot just look at someone and say, hey, that's a Semitic phenotype. No, you could be just looking at a European. So this is extremely important to understand and stress. There is an Indo-European presence in the Bronze Age Middle East, and that presence is still there today in modern Middle Eastern populations. Modern-day Levantines are genetically close to Bronze Age Europeans. modern Kurds, Arabs, and Assyrians in Iraq are genetically close to ancient Iranians. Iranians are a branch of Indo-Europeans. Ancient Iranian ancestry is found in many modern Middle Eastern populations. Also, it likely was the population that introduced Haplogroup J. Northern migrants with ancient Iranian ancestry appeared in the Levant after the collapse of the Akkadian Empire. Akkad was a Semitic civilization in Mesopotamia, and historically Akkad fell to Gutians, who are non-Semitic northern invaders. So when it comes to modern Middle Easterners being related and descending from Europeans, specifically, it would seem like the Europeans that modern-day Middle Easterners are descendants of are the Iranian type of Europeans. So it will be Iranian and possibly even Anatolian, but we'll actually deal with that here in a second. But the main population that seems to be what Middle Easterners are related to is the Iranian Indo-European subgroup, which even matches historically, which we'll cover here in a few seconds. So, but we also need to look into this. Modern Middle Easterners also are genetically Caucasian, because that's another genetic population that's in the Middle East. This is from Parallel Evolution of Genes and Languages in the Caucasus region, and it reads, again, Haplogroup J2A4B*-M67 comprised 51 through 79% of the Y chromosomes in the English, the three Chechenian populations, Northeast Caucasian NAC linguistic group. Finally, Haplogroup J1*-M267 comprised 44 through 99% of the Southeast Caucasus Dangstani linguistic group. Check out previous videos on the NAC Dangstani languages and people. So here is that part of the Caucasus where you have the NAC Dangstani populations, and they have up to 99% of Haplogroup J1 and J2, and you know that's pretty decent percentage, I would say. Continuing, it says the MDS plot of pairwise genetic distances showed strong regional clustering separating populations from Europe, the Near East, and the Caucasus, with samples from the Caucasus grouping closer to the Near East samples than to European ones. Of those three clusters, the Caucasus appears to be the most diverse, with distinguishable subgroup variation within it. The first subgroup included Dagestan speakers, the second group NAC speakers, and the third Abkhaz-Abkhaz speakers. This plot illustrates both the common Near Eastern background of all Caucasus populations and the pronounced intra-Caucasus genetic differentiation into groupings that correspond well with their linguistic affiliation. So basically, what we have is Caucasian populations and Near Eastern populations being very, very close to each other, interestingly enough. It would seem as though that you have Near Eastern populations that are a subgroup of Caucasian populations. Basically, it would seem like you have Near Easterners that are just basically Caucasians. And then we also have Europeans down here. I didn't highlight this, but we did just cover about Europeans and how there are Near Easterners that also seem to be, there are Middle Easterners that also seem to be a sub-branch of Europeans. So you have basically Near Easterners either being a sub-branch of two groups. Near Easterners are either a sub-branch of Indo-Europeans or they're a sub-branch of Caucasians, which is why I say Near Easterners are Irano-Caucasian, because they're either subgroup, of one of the two or kind of both. So it's very interesting. Here's the genetic tree and the linguistic tree. The genetic tree links perfectly with the linguistic tree, and we see this quite often. It's very interesting. We see it with Afro-Asiatic as well. So continuing, it says, combining genetic and linguistic findings, we now propose a model of the evolution of the Caucasus populations. The final tree was obtained by merging the genetic clusters with the background linguistic tree, and that's what we just saw here when they linked it. We conclude that the Caucasus gene pool originated from a subset of Near Eastern pool due to an Upper Paleolithic or Neolithic migration. Now let me read that again. We conclude that the Caucasus gene pool originated from a subset of Near Eastern pool due to an Upper Paleolithic or Neolithic migration. So in a way, you can say that Near Easterners are a subset of Caucasians, followed by significant genetic drift, probably due to isolation in the extremely mountainous landscape. And that kind of reminds me with the same thing with Armenians, how they're genetic isolates, and how they're related to, other genetic isolates in the Near East. So same thing with Caucasians. Some of these Caucasian groups, they're the ones in the Caucasus, like the English and the Chechens, became genetically isolated, but they're still related anciently to other Near Eastern populations. So by looking at Chechens and English, we can get a good idea of these other ancient Near Eastern populations, just like you can with the Armenians. So here is another paper dealing with West Asian ancestry or Middle Eastern ancestry. It's called Human Ancestry Correlates with Language and Reveals that Race is Not an Objective Genomic Classifier. And it reads, West Asian ancestry correlates with Northeast Caucasian, Northwest Caucasian, and Kartvelian, which is another branch of Caucasian, language families, as well as the Armenian branch of the Indo-European language family. So basically, West Asian ancestry is linked to Caucasian ancestry. To expound this point, West Asian ancestry currently exists at its highest frequency in peoples from the Caucasus Mountains and the Levant, which, as we read earlier, the present-day Levant is Bronze Age European, and is the major ancestry of Abkhazian, Georgian, and Druze samples. And we read earlier from the Armenian study how Armenians are related to these very populations as well, to Georgians, Druze, and Azerbaijanis and other Caucasian populations. So everything's coming together. 8. The correlation of West Asian ancestry with Northeast Caucasian, Northwest Caucasian, and Kartvelian languages is consistent with the phylogenetic hypothesis that the three groups of languages are related in a larger grouping called Ibero-Caucasian. So the Nak Dagestani Caucasian populations have up to 99% of haplogroup J, J1 and J2. Caucasians group closer to Near Easterners. There is a common Near Eastern background among all Caucasian populations. Caucasus genetic grouping corresponds with linguistic affiliation, which we just read. The Caucasus gene pool originated from a subset of the Near Eastern pool. The Caucasus gene pool got isolated in the Caucasus Mountains. West Asian ancestry correlates with Caucasian/Armenians. West Asian ancestry, its highest frequency is found in Caucasians in the Caucasus. So now modern Middle Easterners are basically a split between Caucasians and Indo-Europeans. This is what we're going to bring it all together when it comes to these Middle Eastern populations. They're basically a split between Caucasians and Indo-Europeans. So this is from HLA alleles and haplotype in the Turkish population, relatedness to Kurds, Armenians, and other Mediterraneans. Turkish and Kurdish HLA profiles are studied for the first time. The comparative study of their allele frequencies, characteristic haplotypes, genetic distance with other Mediterraneans is complemented by neighbor joining dendrograms and correspondence analysis. Turks, Kurds, Armenians, Iranians, Jews, Lebanese, and other Eastern and Western Mediterranean groups seem to share a common ancestry, the older Mediterranean substratum. Anatolian, Hittite, and Hurrian groups older than 2000 BC. These may have given rise to present-day Kurdish, Armenian, and Turkish populations. So that's starting to bring everything together from a historical standpoint as well. Turks cluster within the Eastern Mediterraneans, including Kurds and Armenians, taking all other different types of data analysis together. Turks, other Anatolians like Kurds and Armenians, and Iranians appear as belonging to the older Mediterranean substratum included within the Eastern Mediterranean group. In summary, it seems then Turks, Kurds, and Armenians are very close genetically, and all of them seem to have been living in the area for many millennia. So basically, Turks, Kurds, Armenians, and various other Middle Eastern populations seem to have a link to Anatolian Hittites and Hurrians, and that these people have been living in these regions of the world for millennia. And that's another thing I want to be known and needs to be stressed, that although I'm saying that there are ancient European and Caucasian populations within the Middle East, this doesn't make them any less Middle Eastern or any less part of that world, because they have been there for thousands of years. If they entered in the Bronze Age and then they're still there in the 21st century, they've quite literally been there for thousands and thousands of years. So I'm not saying that these groups aren't Middle Eastern, or that they don't, that they're not from the Middle East. They are most definitely now Middle Easterners, and that they've been there for a very long time. So don't run off with this and try to discourage people, but just teach the truth when it comes to just the historical aspect of things. Anyways, continuing to the next study reads, genetic HLA study of Kurds in Iraq, Iran, and Tbilisi, Caucasus, Georgia, relatedness and medical implications. Kurds from Iraq have been analyzed for HLA genes. Their HLA genetic profile has been compared with that of older Kurd groups from Iran and Tbilisi, Georgia Caucasus, and also worldwide populations. Our HLA study conclusions are that Kurds most probably belong to an ancient Mediterranean / Middle East / Caucasian genetic substratum, and that present results and those previously obtained by us and Kurds may be useful for medicine in future Kurd transplantation programs. It is discussed that one of the most ancient Kurd groups is in Hurrians, 2000 years BC. And we've gone over the Hurrians. Check out my old videos on the Hurrians if you want to know about them. On the other hand, Kurd people live in different countries in the Near East, such as Syria, Armenia, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran, and also called the so-called Kurdistan, land of the Kurds. Kurdistan is a region placed South Caucasus and north of ancient Mesopotamia. According to genetic studies like HLA, in Turkish and Kurdish populations, an Anatolian Mediterranean source for both populations was put forward. It may be possible that Kurds are initially coming from an ancient Hurrians reviewed in, and it gives the studies. So Kurds could descend from ancient Hurrians. And there is Kurdistan, encompassing all those countries we just read. So the second cluster comprises Europeans, Mediterraneans, Caucasus, and Iranian populations. Iraq Kurds, Iran Kurds, and Georgia Kurds are located relatively close together, which makes sense. Here is the tree dealing with them. Here's Iran Kurds, Iraq Kurds, and Georgia Kurds. They also seem to be related to groups like Cretans and Armenians and Georgians and etc. Plain genetic distance, DA, show that Iraq Kurds' closest genetic distances are the following: Near Eastern populations, Iran Kurds, Palestinians, Fars Parsi, Georgia Kurds, and Ashkenazi Jews. Eastern Mediterranean populations, Armenians, Cretans, and Macedonians, and Mediterranean populations, Sardinians, Spaniards, Algerians, and Italians. So kind of like what we read earlier from the Armenian study, we see that Kurds, another population that seems to be European, but also Caucasian, is related to various other mostly non-Semitic speakers, Europeans and Caucasians. And there's some Middle Eastern people also sprinkled in there. Again, that's another, there's some Semitic speaking people that's also sprinkled in there. So again, we have to ask ourselves, why do you have these Semitic people related to non-Semitic people? Mostly these Indo-European and Caucasian peoples. So here is the chart showing that Georgia Kurds, Iraq Kurds, Iran Kurds being related to a lot of European populations and Caucasian populations, with a few Semitic populations mixed in, or Semitic speaking is the correct term. So continuing, it says, our conclusions were that their HLA profile showed that Kurds form part of Mediterranean stock of people and also had Caucasus genetic traits, Slav Georgians or Savan Georgians. Also, it is worth mentioning that Lak population, East Caucasus area, may be close to both Lur and Kurd populations, and Lak name could be considered composed of Lur and Kurd words. In the present paper, we have analyzed HLA genes in Kurds living in North Iraq, comprised with other populations, placed them as a Middle East population close to Kurds in Tbilisi, Georgia, Palestinians, Armenians, and Kurds from Iran. In both analysis, Kurds are also close to Caucasian populations. Conclusion is that Kurds are genetically close to surrounding Caucasian and Mediterranean populations, and that have remained settled down in Kurdistan since ancient times, supporting historical evidence. Supporting historical evidence is reviewed in our previous work. HLA genetic similarity have been reported between Turks, whose genes belong to old Anatolian stock, and Kurds. Kurds and Turks speak languages that are included in different families. However, Kurd HLA genetic studies include them into Mediterranean stock together with Turks. Other genetic studies based on Y chromosome in Kurds from Turkey, Georgia, and Iran identify the dominant presence of haplogroups originated in Middle East, Anatolia, or Mesopotamia that show a close association with Jews, Lebanese, and Turkish genes. Also, Iran populations are close to Kurds, and there we go with Iran again. Iran seems to be a really strong indicator of an ancient European presence in the Middle East. So, thus, Middle East peoples from Mediterranean border, the Kurds seem originally to belong to a similar ethnic group according to HLA autosomic and Y chromosomes genes results. Kurds have always lived in the mountains, being autochthonous 6000 BC. Hurrians, whose language was Caucasian and not Indo-European, may be Kurds' ancient genetic background, reviewed in references. By 1200 BC, Medes and others invaded Hurrian area. In summary, all three Kurd populations studied in the present paper are genetically close together and to other Mediterranean and Caucasus populations according to HLA genes. So basically, Kurds are related to other Middle Easterners, and they are seemingly a subset of Caucasian Iranian group, and so that's pretty important to know when it comes to the background of the Middle East. Population genetic relationship between Mediterranean populations determined by HLA allele distribution and the historic and a historic perspective. Kurds and Armenians are genetically very close to Turks and other Middle Eastern populations. Again, Kurds and Armenians, which we covered earlier, are genetically close to Turks and other Middle East populations. So, Turks, Kurds, Armenians, Iranians, Jews, Lebanese, etc. all share common ancestry. Anatolian Hittite and Hurrians may have given rise to Kurdish, Armenian, and Turkish populations. And Anatolian Hittites, by the way, are a group of Indo-European peoples, and Hurrians are ancient Caucasian peoples. Turks, Kurds, and Armenians are very closely genetically. Iraq Kurds, Iran Kurds, and Georgia Kurds cluster with Europeans, Mediterraneans, Caucasians, and Iranian populations. Iraq Kurds' closest genetic distance is with Palestinians, Georgia Kurds, Ashkenazi Jews, Armenians, Cretans, Macedonians, Sardinians, Spaniards, and Italians, etc. Kurds have Caucasus genetic traits, and Kurds are close to Caucasian populations. Iran populations are close to Kurds genetically. Hurrians may be Kurds' ancient genetic background. Kurds, Armenians, and Turks are genetically close to each other and other Middle Eastern populations. In a roundabout way, other Middle Eastern populations are basically related to ancient Europeans and Caucasians, and Hurrians and Hittites. So basically, what we see, putting all this information together, is that many of these Middle Eastern populations are genetically very similar to each other. Whether they are Indo-European speakers, whether they are Caucasian speakers, or whether they are Semitic speakers, they all seem to be genetically the same people. Genetically speaking, modern Middle Easterners seem to be a subset of ancient Europeans and Caucasian populations that went into the Middle East. Also, yes, we see an ancient presence of Indo-Europeans and Caucasian populations in the Middle East. Specifically, these populations were a branch of Iranian Indo-Europeans, and the Hurrians were a branch of Caucasians that had an ancient presence in the Near East. Historically speaking, this makes sense. First of all, many historians make it quite known that the Hurrians, a Caucasian population, held great influence in the ancient Near East and made up a significant population. This is from the book The Chechens, and it reads, some authorities believe that the Nak nation was an offspring of the Hurrians and Uratrians, builders of magnificent civilizations in the Near East that had profound influences upon other cultures of the region. I'll read that again. That had profound influences upon other cultures in the region. This is from Who Were the Hurrians by Andrew Lawyer. And it reads, But Piotr Mikulski, an Assyrianologist at the University of Michigan, notes that Hurrian, like Sumerian, is a language unrelated to Semitic or Indo-European tongues that dominated the region during and after the 3rd millennia BCE. Perhaps, he suggests, the Hurrians were earlier inhabitants of the region, who, like the Sumerians, had to make room for the Semitic-speaking people who created the First World Empire based at Akkad in central Mesopotamia around 2350 BC. Far from being yet another rough nomadic tribe, such as the Amorites or the Cassites, who were latecomers to the Mesopotamian party, the Hurrians and their unique language, music, deities, and rituals may have played a key role in shaping the first cities, empires, and states. Let me read that again. Played a key role in shaping the first cities, empires, and states. The language has died, the music faded, and the rituals are forgotten. But thanks to the sculptors, stonemasons, and seal carvers at Ugarish, Hurrian creativity can shine once again. This is from a World History Encyclopedia, the Hurrians, and it reads, the Hurrians were a Bronze Age people who flourished across the Near East from the 4th millennium BCE to the 1st millennium BCE. Hurrians formed the principal cultural element of the Bronze Age Mitanni kingdom and blended with the culture of neighboring and then conquering Hittites. By the late Bronze Age, the Hurrians had been assimilated into surrounding cultures in the Near East, but many of their gods and myths will live on in later cultures, notably the Eretrian civilization, and even inspired elements of myth found in archaic Greece. This is from Narrative Literature of Hurrian Origin, Moving Treasures from the Ancient Near East. And it reads, the Hurrians were one of the most important civilizations of the Ancient Near East, but we have far less linguistic, historical, and archaeological information about them than the Sumerians, Babylonians, Assyrians, or Hittites. Hurrian epic poems are also a fascinating but lesser known aspect of ancient Near Eastern literacy traditions. But Hurrians played another critical role creating and transmitting Mesopotamian traditions across the ancient world, even as far as Greece. So, like I said, there's a strong influence among Hurrians in the ancient Near East. Most historians will agree with that. And the Hurrians, a branch of Caucasians, had a strong impact when it came to the history of the ancient Near East. And historically, we do see a large influx of Indo-European Iranians and even Anatolian groups into the Middle East, notably civilizations such as the Hittites, the Mitanni, and the Cassites, all of them having, or two out of one of them having a lot of Iranian Vedic names, Vedic being Indian, or technically Aryan. Hittite was an Indo-European language that was spoken by the Hittites, a people of Bronze Age Anatolia, who created an empire centered on Hutasa, as well as parts of the northern Levant and upper Mesopotamia. This is from Iran Arts and Architecture from Britannia, and it reads, much less is known about the northwestern part of modern Iran during the 2nd millennium BCE, but from about 1000 BCE onward, it acquired a new importance. The southward migration of Indo-European peoples many centuries earlier, which had brought the Hittites to Anatolia and the Cassites to Babylon, was now followed by a new wave of peoples. So, detailing again this Indo-Europeans coming into the Middle East. This is from Hittite people from Britannia. Hittite, member of an ancient Indo-European people who appeared in Anatolia at the beginning of the second millennium BCE. By 1340 BCE, they had become one of the dominant powers of the Middle East. And they were very powerful. They even matched Egypt. There was an epic battle that happened in Kadesh against the Hittites and the Egyptians. And it was really a stalemate. Like they were powerful. This is from the Hittites from the Metropolitan Museum, and it reads, "The Hittites who spoke an Indo-European language, a family of languages that includes English, dominated much of Anatolia and neighboring regions between about 1650 and 12,000 BCE. It has been suggested that groups speaking languages related to Hittite first entered Anatolia at the end of the 3rd millennium BC, but the Hittites first rose to prominence around 1750 BC. So here is the kingdom of the Hittites, the Hittite Anatolia, and as they said, it was a very large empire, taking up much of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and all of this is Indo-Europeans in the Middle East. So, if someone were to say, I don't know, Anatolia or Turkey was always Semitic, like that would be inaccurate. No, it had Indo-Europeans there. So this is why I say you can't just say Middle East and generalize. You have to make sure you differentiate when it comes to these things. So the names of the Mitanni aristocracy frequently are of Indo-Aryan origin, and their deities also show Indo-Aryan roots, Mitra, Indra, etc. These Indo-Aryan deities are listed in 2 treaties between Mitanni and Hatti from Hattusa. This is from the Mitanni Ancient Kingdom, Mesopotamia, Asia, from Britannia, and it reads, Mitanni, Indo-Iranian Empire centered in northern Mesopotamia that flourished from about 1500 to 1360 BC. Mitanni was one of the several kingdoms and small states, another being Hurri, founded by the Indo-Iranians in Mesopotamia and Syria. Although originally these Indo-Iranians were probably members of Aryan tribes that later settled in India, they apparently broke off from the main tribes on the way and migrated to Mesopotamia instead, where they settled among the Hurrian peoples and soon became the ruling noble class called Mari-Anu. So with these Iranian Aryan peoples coming into the Middle East, that kind of probably explains that ancient Iranian influence when it comes to the DNA of many modern-day Middle Easterners. You did, in fact, have literal Indo-Iranians or Aryans in the Middle East. And this is why I said when it comes to the Armenoid invasion, think of it as the Aryan invasion, because it's kind of the same thing. Basically, a branch of Aryans, one went into India to conquer the Dravidian peoples, and another went into the Middle East to conquer the Semitic peoples. So it's kind of interesting. This is from Indo-Iranian Personal Names in Mitanni, and it reads, at the beginning of the 20th century, some Indo-Aryan or Iranian proper names and glosses were found in documents from Egypt, northern Mesopotamia, and Syria, mainly from the land of the Hurrian region of Mitanni. These language fossils occur in Hittite, Egyptian, and Hurrian documents concerning the kingdom of Mitanni. El Armana letters, 14th century BC, a treaty between the Hittites and the Mitanni, 1380 BC. So just to show you, like, in terms of the linguistic tree where Aryans come from, Proto-Indo-Aryan It basically comes from the Proto-Iranian, and then the Proto-Indo-Iranian, and then Proto-Indo-Iranian comes from Proto-Indo-European. Then it says down here, right here, that Proto-Indo-Aryan is meant to be the predecessor of Old Indo-Aryan, which was from 1500 through 300 BCE, which is directly attested as Vedic and classical Sanskrit, as well as by the Indo-Aryan superstrate in Mitanni. Indeed, Vedic Sanskrit is very close to Proto-Indo-Aryan. And so basically, like I said earlier, you have one group of Aryans going into India, and then another group going into the Middle East, forming the Mitanni Empire. And then from Proto-Indo-Aryan, you get Indo-Aryan. And Indo-Aryan is a branch of the Indo-Iranian languages themselves, bring a branch of the Indo-European language family. And so here, down here, just to visualize everything for you, you have the Proto-Indo-European to Proto-Indo-Iranian to Proto-Indo-Aryan, and then over here you have Indo-European, Indo-Iranian, then Indo-Aryan, and then the subdivisions of Sanskrit, which is in India, and then you have the Mitanni Aryan, which is in the Middle East, the ancient Middle East. So here's the Mitanni kingdom, where these Aryans or Iranians came into the Middle East, and as we can see, they had a large swath of land, which explains why many Middle Easterners today have Iranian ancestry, because they did occupy a very large section of the Middle East. And here are the Hurrians, who were also a large population of Caucasian peoples in Mitanni in the Middle East, which also explains the Caucasian DNA in Middle Easterners. So this is early Vedic period from Britannia, and it reads that there was a migration of Indo-European speakers, possibly in waves, dating from the 2nd millennium BCE, as clear from archaeological and epigraphic evidence in Western Asia. Mesopotamia witnessed the arrival about 1760 BCE of the Cassites, who introduced the horse and the chariot and borrowed Indo-European names. A treaty from about 1400 BCE between the Hittites, who had arrived in Anatolia about the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC, and the Mitanni Empire invoked several deities, such as Mitra and Indra, and etc. An inscription at Bog Azeko in Anatolia of about the same date contains Indo-European technical terms pertaining to the training of horses, which suggests cultural origins in Central Asia or the southern Russian steppes. Clay tablets dating to about 1400 BCE, written at Tel Amarna in Upper Egypt in Akkadian cuneiform, mentions names of princes that are also Indo-European. So you basically waves of Indo-Europeans coming into the Middle East, a lot of them being basically Iranian or Aryan. And so this next source also details the Indo-European migrations into the Middle East. Again, I just want to stress that this did occur, a migration of Indo-European peoples into the Middle East, which explains, genetically why we see Middle Easterners with this genetic background. So this this book is called The Peoples of the Highland, Vanished Cultures of Larston, Mani, and Urartu. So it reads, during the 2nd millennium, the long process began by which Indo-European peoples from the northern steppes beyond the Caucasus established themselves about Western Asia, Iran, and northern India. Their earliest pressure perhaps drove some the native peoples of the mountains to migrate or infiltrate, and sometimes come as invaders into Mesopotamia and northern Syria, even in the 3rd millennium. The Indo-Europeans then drove their way through these peoples, drawing many of them in their train as subjects or allies, and appeared themselves early in the 2nd millennium as invaders and conquerors in the Near East. For the first half of the millennium, the Highlanders under Indo-European leadership dominated the other peoples of the plains, most of whom were Semites. So these Indo-Europeans began to dominate the Semitic populations that were in the plains. Likely would have been peoples like the Akkadians and others. Two other peoples are directly relevant, namely the Cassites from the Zagros Mountains in the region of Luristan, and the Hurrians, who spread from regions further north, particularly from Armenia. Both were themselves native peoples of the Highland and spoke languages which were not Indo-European, but belonged to a group sometimes loosely called Caucasian, once widespread but later surviving only in the Caucasus. They were led by Indo-European aristocracies, small in number but great in energy and achievement. They were the first to use the horse in war, to draw the light chariot with spoked wheels. Indo-European names of gods at least appear among the Cassites, and of gods and rulers much more obviously among the Hurrians, in whom this element was clearly stronger. In both cases, the names reveal the Indric branch of the Indo-European family, of which the main body moved through Iran to conquer northern India. So we do see a very strong ancient association with the Hurrians and these Indo-Europeans, that they traveled with one another and that they, were allies to each other and fought with one another against other peoples. So this is from the book Who Were the Greeks? And it reads, about 2000 BC, Babylonian documents begin to record a long, gradual expansion of alien tribes from beyond the Tigris, originating in or beyond the mountains, and by about 1760, Babylonia itself became subject to the Cassite Dynasty, whose official language was neither Semitic nor Sumerian, nor indeed of any recognized affinity. But as the Cassites introduced the horse into Babylonia and used it like the Aryans, who were bringing it at about the same time into northern India, not for riding but for drawing wheeled chariots, it is inferred that they had been in contact before arrival in Babylonia with people of Aryan culture and speech. More than this, among the names of Cassite kings are some which appear to contain Indo-European elements, as though they belonged to families which had once used Indo-European speech, but had lost it as their official language, through assimilation to the people of Cassite speech, whose movement they were now directing. Some Cassite deities, too, seem to have Indo-European names. So here's a Cassite Babylon, a map. And this, again, will be a mixture of Indo-Europeans and Hurrians. Again, this explains why genetically we see an affinity of Caucasian and Indo-European in the Middle East, because these peoples were there. They were present back then. And Cassite Babylon ruled for 500 years. So we have for 500 years an Indo-European Caucasian population of people. 500 years, yeah. So the Indo-European Iranians and Caucasian Hurrians basically would have stretched from Anatolia all the way to Iran and Iraq. The Indo-European empires of the Hittites, the Mitannis, and the Cassites all were long ruling dynasties with populations of Indo-Europeans and Caucasians. This is extremely important to keep in mind when studying the ancient Near East. Here is the Hittites in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. Here is the Mitanni Empire, pretty much in the center of the Middle East. And then here's Cassite Babylon in Iraq. And everybody north of this back then would have been Hurrians, Caucasian tribes. Now, one interesting thing we do see between these Indo-European Iranians and Caucasian Hurrians is a strong bond between the ancient Iranians and Hurrians of the Near East, and they often intermixed with one another. There was also a cultural assimilation between the two populations, and they ruled for centuries in the Near East. This is from the book The Chechenians, and it reads, "The Hurrians were so ubiquitous that many Indo-Iranian and Indo-European peoples are believed to have substantive Hurrian contributions in their ethnogenesis. For example, the Kurds consider themselves and their culture as descendants of the Hurrians and their civilization despite linguistic differentiation. There is also suggestions that the ancestors of the Armenians were a mixture of Hurrians and Indo-European Peregrines." So basically what this book is saying is that there seems to be a link between the Hurrians and Indo-Iranians, like there was a lot of mixing between the two peoples. This is from World History Encyclopedia, the Hurrians, and it reads, "From the 16th through 15th century BCE, there was increasing antagonism between the Hittite Empire and Mitanni. This was a continuation of the hostilities between Hittites and Hurrians, which had been going on in the 17th century BCE, Syria being a particular bone of contention. Although a consequence of Hittite expansion was that as more Hurrians came under Hittite rule, there was a further spreading of Hurrian cultural elements westward, especially deities, which were borrowed and loaned between the two cultures, and others in the region. For example, the Hurrian storm god Tushub became identified with the Anatolian god of the same function, Tar-Hunza. Once more, the Hurrian culture was being assimilated by both friend and foe across the region. Following the conquest and division of Mitanni by Assyria and Hatti in the 3rd century BCE, the Hurrian language and culture continued under the political control of the Hittites and Assyrians. By the 1st millennium BCE, the Hurrians had been absorbed into other cultures of the region, but as previously, elements of their culture became intermixed with that of their successors. So again, I'm just reiterating how there was an intermix of culture and eventually even of people. The Assyrians knew that the kingdom of Han-Egal-Bat and the Hittites referred to the people as the Hurri, and their territory as the land of the Hurri, the land of the Hurrians. And as most present-day scholars agree, they were Hurrians. They used the language of the local people, which was at the time a non-Indo-Iranian language, Hurrian. Scholar Gwyndolian Lilik writes, "The population of Mitanni was predominantly Hurrian, but the ruling elites were Indo-European warriors who called themselves Mariuna and who worshipped deities with Vedic names such as Indra and the collective devas. This elite was to intermarry with the local population, as the names of their children testify." So let me read that part again. This elite, the elite being the Indo-Iranians, was to intermarry with the local population, as the names of their children testify. So the Indo-Iranians and the Hurrians began to mix with one another, which again explains genetically what we see in the Middle East, a split between Caucasian and Iranian genomes. So now we should ask ourselves, what happened to these ancient civilizations full of Indo-European Iranians and Caucasian Hurrians? What happened to their mixed descendants? Did they just disappear? Poof, like the snap from the Avengers? Were they lost to history? Look, you have Hittites, Anatolia, you have the Mitanni, you have the Cassites, lots of empires of these Indo-Iranians and Hurrians. What happened to to these empires? What happened to these peoples? Did they all just drive themselves into the ocean of the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf, and the Red Sea? Did they just up and leave? What happened to these people? Of course, the descendants of the ancient Hittites, Mitanni, Cassites, etc., didn't just disappear from the snap of Thanos' gauntlet. These ancient civilizations were in Anatolia, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, etc. And the people of these lands today are their descendants. The DNA lines up perfectly with what these people genetically are that we covered earlier. They are a split between ancient Iranians and Caucasians, or in better words, a mix between these two historical groups. Historically, this is why I use the term Irano-Caucasian as well. The ancient civilizations and ethnic groups of the Middle East matches the modern populations. They are genetically Caucasian Iranians. But what is the Y DNA haplogroup of these ancient Caucasian Iranian populations that lived in the ancient Middle East? This study is called How Eurasia Was Born, and it reads, while early Indo-Europeans who originally crossed from Anatolia in the Bronze Age were most likely represented by various J2 subclades, genetic data suggests that as soon as they reached Central Europe, they assimilated large masses of the native population, and from then on, the rest of their expansion were characterized by more recently formed subclades of the haplogroup characteristic to the native populations. Haplogroups J2A and J2B all have subclades that spread out both to Europe and through the Iranian plateau to India. What further complicates the situation is that their earliest subclades that had spread to Europe the first time are older than the earliest subclades that had spread to India through Iran through the Iranian plateau. Both of these haplogroups at the same time have subclades widespread in Syria and Mesopotamia, but most of these subclades that are younger than their subclades that had first spread to Europe. This suggests a starting location of these subclades somewhere around Anatolia, since had their starting location been in Syria or Mesopotamia, then the latter regions should be abundant in ancient subclades of these haplogroups predating their first spread to Europe. Ancient subclades of J1 are found somewhat east of this, either in the Armenian Highlands or the Levant. This makes North Mesopotamia at Azria region a possible starting point for J1, as subclades of J1 also migrated to Iran and India, and the estimated age of the most recent common ancestors of these subclades often coincide with subclades of J2 migrations, which were both J1 and J2 participated. As many of these J2 subclades also have some of their own subclades apparently migrating to Europe at the same time, this is a further sign that their location of origins had to be west of the starting point, at the west of the point of origin of J1. While having these subclades of J2 starting from Anatolia would have met with J1 and J2 subclades with coinciding ages simply carried eastward to Iran and Mesopotamia as part of the very same migration as much more plausible scenario, further supporting both J2A and J2B having started to spread out of Anatolia and J1 east of them in Syria and the Armenian Highlands. Among J2A and J2B, J2A seems to have been located westward of J2B as it participated in more ancient westward migrations to Europe than J2B. This gives us the west to east order of J2A in southwest Anatolia, J2B in southeast Anatolia, and J1 in Syria and the Armenian Highlands. Alduin, I'll pause right here. So here is what they're talking about when it comes to the Indo-European expansion. This paper deals with more of an Anatolian expansion, and so it's basically saying that these J markers would have popped up in Anatolia. And check out my Indo-European origin, my Anatolian Indo-European origin, because it kind of matches perfectly with this scenario, that they would have spread and migrated from Anatolia, and the J markers would have basically went with the ancient Indo-Europeans. But now I'm going to actually read down below. Alduin, which is Caucasian, in Syria, represented by a population characterized by the presence of J1, we narrow the circle of the Indo-European homeland, and where all this signs point to is southeast Anatolia, and an ancient population there, represented by a population characterized most notably by the presence of haplogroup J2B. This also explains the linguistic link between Indo-European and Northwest Caucasian, suggested by Caroso, as Northwest Caucasian populations appear to have moved to their present position from south of the Caucasus, and thus a position somewhere in east central Anatolia, east of ancient Kartvelian populations. Kartvelian is Caucasian, west of the ancient Alduin populations, and north of the Proto-Indo-Europeans in Sicilia, would explain their linguistic position. Genetic traces of a major expansion spread over much of Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia are visible in the form of the subclade J2B-PF7321 of haplogroup J2B. Phylogenetic patterns of J2B J2B-PF3721 show a rapid divergence, with the formation of several subclades taking place between 3800 through 3700 BCE, covering much of Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia. This demographic event seems to be the most plausible candidate for the earliest phase of Indo-European expansion, spreading out of the homeland in Sicilia and conquering most of Anatolia, except for the Kartvelian and Hittite-speaking northern parts and the Alduin-speaking Armenian Highlands at this stage, of course, and northern Mesopotamia before the Semitic expansion would take over northern Mesopotamia 1 millennia later. Several Indo-European languages seem to have diverted from their closest Anatolian sibling lineages at this time. Thus, many represent consecutive waves of migrations to Europe, such as J2B-Z622, formed in 3700 BCE, J2A-BY40424, 3400 BCE, J2A-8344, formed in 10700 BCE, but TMRCA is 3400 BCE. Therefore, could have arrived up until then. J2B-Y22063, formed in 2400 BCE. J2B-Z2507, 2400 BCE. J2A-Z38352, 2300 BCE. J2A-Y93015, 1900 BCE. J2A-Z39995, 1700 BCE. J2A-Z435, 1600 BCE. TMRCA is 1500 BCE. Spread over broad regions of Europe. A migration which may or may not have been identical with the Middle Bronze Age migration from Anatolia to the Balkan hypothesized by James Mallard. It is hard to determine whether if J2b-Z2507 already represents early Indo-Europeans or an early plausible Terracinian wave, a wave of migration from Anatolia. This shows signs of a migration that spread all over Europe in that time frame, possibly starting at the Balkans up until then. This could mean both of either the Terracinian or the Indo-European expansions, or even a scenario where it originally represented Thracians and then Indo-Europeanized later in a way that most of its European expansion was already Indo-European. This exactly fits where we should look for. This exactly fits where we should look for early Indo-European expansions in Europe according to circumstantial evidence described. With being widespread all over Europe, J2A-Z435 may also be a plausible candidate for the two and other lineages that arrive between them, may even represent a series of successive waves of early Indo-European migrants from Anatolia to Europe. So again, here's a map showing haplogroup J, specifically J2, how it perfectly overmatches with Indo-European peoples. And so now let's deal with the Caucasian branch of haplogroup J. So this is from EUpedia, Middle East Regional DNA Project. The Caucasus was the birthplace of bronze metallurgy and the two great Bronze Age cultures that stemmed from it, the Maya and Core-Araxes cultures, expanded far and wide and reshaped the genetic landscape of Western Asia, Western Eurasia. South Caucasians would have belonged to haplogroups J1 and J2, later associated with the Core-Araxes culture. We sought to estimate the time when the Iranian ancestry penetrated the Levant. The most significant result was for mixture of Neolithic Levant and Iranian Chalcolithic around 181 plus minus 54 generations ago, or 5,000 plus or minus 1,500 years ago, assuming a migration time of 28 years. The admixture time also overlaps with the rise and fall of the Akkadian Empire, which controlled the region from Iran to the Levant between 4.4 and 4.2 KYA. The Akkadian expansion is argued to have been the result of a widespread aerification event around 4,200 years ago, possibly caused by a volcanic eruption. Archaeological evidence in this period documents large-scale influxes of refugees from northern Mesopotamia towards the south, where cities and villages became overpopulated. Future sampling of ancient DNA from northern Syria and Iraq may reveal if these migrants carried the Iranian Chalcolithic related ancestry we observe in Bronze Age Sidon and Jordan. We found an ancestry related to ancient Iranians that is ubiquitous today in all Middle Easterners. Previous studies showed that this ancestry was not present in the Levant during the Neolithic period, but appeared in the Bronze Age, where 50% of the local ancestry was replaced by a population carrying ancient Iranian-related ancestry. This population potentially introduced the Y chromosome haplogroup J1 into the region. This is from How Eurasia Was Born. The Northeast Caucasian language family seems to show clear links to ancient Eastern Anatolia, as most subclades of J1-Z1842 TMRCA is 4,300 BCE, can be linked to the Armenian Highlands in present-day Azerbaijan, precisely fitting the exact location of the Core-Araxes culture, 3,000 to 400 BCE through 2000 BCE. The three subclades of it, J1-ZS3042 TMRCA is 3,500 BCE, J1-ZS5658 TMRCA is 2,800 BCE, J1-ZS2872 2800 BCE, and J1-Y 5353 TMRCA is 2500 BCE, are widespread among Northeast Caucasian groups, suggesting Northeast Caucasian languages to have originated from the core Araxes culture, as ancient J1 subclades also seem to have been present in the ancient Levant as well. This supports the existence of the Aldoan language family, linking Hurrian to Northeast Caucasian. Regarding the Northwest Caucasian language family, broader analysis of other genetic components by Besvi confirmed that Northwest Caucasian populations also originated from south of the Caucasus, thus from within the cradle of the Neolithic Middle East. This also supports their supposed relations to the Indo-European family, and suggests that their homeland must have been in close proximity with that of the Indo-European homeland in eastern Anatolia. On the other hand, it must have been west of the Northeast Caucasian homeland, as the latter seem to have covered the entire core Araxes culture area. The presence of J2-M67 in Northwest Caucasian populations also points to origins south of the Caucasus, although as J2-M67 is present in human populations belonging to both Northwest Caucasian and Northeast Caucasian language groups, it is somewhat ambiguous to which language family did the population that introduced it in the region belong to. So here is a map detailing the Caucasian admixture. This is based on autosomal data from DotaCAD project. And so we see its highest concentration is in the Caucasus, then it expands into the Middle East. And then you see with haplogroup J1 and J2, it's the same thing. Highest concentrations is in the Caucasus, and then it expands into the Middle East. And so Caucasian DNA and haplogroup J seems to correlate with one another. So we see a strong association with haplogroup J, specifically J2, with ancient Indo-Europeans, but we also see a strong association of haplogroup J, specifically J1, and even J2, with Caucasians. The spread of haplogroup J into the Middle East fits with the spread of ancient Iranians and Hurrians. It was when these ancient Indo-Iranian or these Indo-Caucasian civilizations in the Near East began to arise, which was after the fall of the Semitic civilizations in Mesopotamia. Make that clear one more time. After the fall of Semitic civilizations in Mesopotamia is when we see this ancient Indo-Caucasian civilizations rise and haplogroup J migrate into the Middle East. But if haplogroup J are Indo-Europeans and Caucasians in ancient times, then we have to ask this question: how is haplogroup J Semitic today? But this is where we end the genetic expansion of the Armenoids, Caucasian Iranian DNA. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like. Don't forget to subscribe and share the video. Click the bell and follow my social media platforms that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. And feel free to leave a comment for any questions you might have. And with all of that out of the way, have a great day and shalom.